For our second lesson, we are looking at multiplying and dividing integers. And notice that we're still not allowed to use a calculator. Okay, so don't cheat, be honest, can't use a calculator. We're still talking about integers, so remember that's whole numbers, positives and negatives. Okay, so last time we added and subtracted them, and today we're going to be multiplying and dividing, which is a lot easier, in my opinion, than adding and subtracting. Now, assuming that you are good with your times tables and can do like 2 times 10 or whatever the multiplication or division might be, the only thing you really have to be concerned with is the sign on your answer positive or negative? Okay, so that's what this middle part is right here. It says to determine if your answer is positive or negative, you're going to use the tic-tac-toe board right here on the right. Now, personally, when I got my first quiz or I got my first exam, I would make this little tic-tac-toe board at the top, and I would use it like we're about to help me figure out if my answer is positive or negative. Now, if you've never seen this before, you put a plus sign to represent a positive on one of the diagonals. So I could have done it there or there, doesn't matter. And you're going to put negative signs everywhere else. Okay, and this will tell you whether your answer is positive or negative. And it's kind of cool because it works in so many different directions. So like, for example, if I was doing a negative times a positive, that's a negative. If I was doing a negative times a negative, that's a positive. If I was doing a negative times a positive, that's a negative. So you can go any direction on this, you guys, and it works for division too. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. Okay, so let's kind of put it into play here and show you how it works. I have negative 4 times positive 6. Let's do the sign first. I have a negative times a positive. So I just got to find that somewhere. You just can't start in the middle. You got to start on an end. Let's see here. In the middle. Negative times a positive is a negative. So my answer is going to be a negative. The negative kind of takes over. And 4 times 6, 24. Okay, number 2. So I have a positive divided by a negative. So here's a positive. Positive divided by a negative is a negative. So I know my answer is negative, and hopefully I know 9 divided by 3 is 3. If you've got 3 numbers going on, you just read it from left to right. So I'm going to work out the first multiplication, the first product here, before I think about the negative 4. I see a negative times a negative. Okay, so a negative times a negative is a positive. And 2 times 10 is 20. Now I'm going to bring down this times negative 4. Now I'm looking at a positive times a negative. So a positive times a negative is a negative. And 20 times 4, realize if you need to write it out like this, you should. 4 times 0 is 0. 4 times 2, 80. Okay, do not be afraid to write it out if you need to. If you got an exam and I tell you you can't use a calculator, you should not guess, you should write it out. Number 4, I've got a negative divided by a negative. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. Ooh, and this kind of throws people off sometimes. These are big numbers. So another way to write a division problem is to write it as a fraction. And whatever number comes first, you put that on top. Here's a little shortcut to use, you guys. If there's a 0 on the top and on the bottom, you can just cross them off. And I see another set of zeros, so I'm going to cross that off. And that's just 46 divided by 1, which we all know that that's just 46. Okay, so division problems kind of helps to write it out as a fraction sometimes. If I look at number 5, I see 3 numbers again, so I know that I should just do the first 2. And they're both positive, so I don't have to use my tic-tac-toe. I know that the answer is going to be a positive. Common mistake. People will say 4 divided by 16 is 4. But be careful. If I wrote it as a fraction, 4 over 16, and I reduced that fraction, which technically we haven't really worked on that, but I could divide both of those by 4. And let's see, 4 divided by 4 is 1 on top, and then 4 on bottom. So 4 divided by 16 is not 4, it's actually 1/4. 4 pieces of pizza is not the same thing as 1/4 of a piece of pizza. You'd be a lot hungrier if you only got 1/4. Okay, so I'm actually not done. This first answer was 1/4, but I have to multiply it by -1. Okay, so let's go back to our tic-tac-toe. Positive times a negative times a negative is a negative. And gross, it's a fraction, but 1 times anything is itself. So -1/4 is my answer. Okay, I've got a negative times a negative on number 6. Negative times a negative is a positive. And I showed you this because I wanted to show you the trick of the 9s. So let's see how good this works. If you're doing 9 times any number that's less than 10, you put out your hands, and I'm trying to do 9 times 6. Okay, so I put my hands out. You start counting from this pinky. And I'm going to count 6 because that's what I'm multiplying by. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So whichever finger was what you're multiplying by, you put that finger down, and what's left is your answer. And your hands, or the finger that went down separates it. So 9 times 6 is 5 and 4, which is 54. And I'll show you another one. Let's say you were doing like 9 times 4. So you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. You'd put that finger down, and your answer would be 36. 36. Use that. I sometimes still do. Number 7. Multiply the first two first. Negative times a positive is a negative. If you can't do 12 times 4 in your head, write it out. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 1, -48. Bring down your -2. Negative times a negative times a negative is a positive. Same thing, I'm not maybe totally sure what 48 times 2 is, so let's multiply it. 2 times 8 is 16, that's 8, plus 1, 96. On the last one, I've got a positive divided by a negative. Positive divided by a negative is a negative. Okay, so notice I'm figuring out the sign first, and then I'm trying to determine what the number is. When the first number is smaller than the second number, your answer is going to be a fraction. And I know it's negative, so I'm going to write it out like a fraction, just like I did on number 4. Realize that you should always reduce your fractions. Always reduce. I'm highlighting that because that is super important. I can divide both of these by 5. So that's going to give me negative, let's see, 25 divided by 5 is 5. 45 divided by 5 is 9. Always reduce.